Where some artists like Ingres tried to reject the label of romantic, other artists like Teilhard Gericault embraced that label. Gericault and his close contemporary Delacroix both envisioned themselves as romantics and saw this label as a way to try to break out of what they saw as the stifling, old-fashioned, and stuffy ways of traditional training and becoming an artist in France in the early 19th century. Gericault is probably best remembered today for this painting, the Raft of the Medusa, because this painting is widely considered his masterpiece. It's at an extremely large size and scale. It's about 18 feet high and 42 feet wide. And that is the size and scale of a history painting, but the events that he records here are of a relatively contemporary event, one that happened just about 2 years before he paints this picture. And this tells the story of the survivors of the shipwreck of the Medusa. And the Medusa wrecks off the coast of Africa. There aren't enough lifeboats for everybody on board, so a raft is built from parts of the ship, and 150 people are left on this raft. The original plan is that the lifeboats will tow the raft to shore, but that quickly proves to be impossible. These 150 people on the raft are left to drift on the ocean off the coast of Africa for approximately 2 weeks, and when they're rescued 2 weeks later, only about 15 of the original 150 are still alive. They had very limited supplies of food and water, and some people just simply went mad and walked off the edge of the raft and ended up drowning. This obviously was a huge news story, especially as the captain of the Medusa had gotten his positions largely through family connections rather than through skill. And just like today, once the survivors got home, many of them did exactly what we'd expect, and they wrote a book. And Gericault seems to have been profoundly influenced by the book of two survivors, Courreard and Savigny. And importantly, Courreard and Savigny are also abolitionists. They're people that are working to end the slave trade. So, like in Engels' piece that we talked about in the last video, Gericault brings contemporary events, race, and mixes those all up in this mix of emotions in his painting. If we start by looking at the right-hand side of the raft, we can see that the people are surging upward into a broadly triangular composition. And if we look at this figure at the top of the composition, he is a black man. This is something we can very clearly see in the sketches for this painting. There's large numbers of existing sketches that still exist for this painting. And we can see Gericault intentionally change the skin color of this figure to reinforce the abolitionist ideas that he's absorbing from Courreard and Savigny's manuscript. We also see Courreard, he's this figure here next to the mast with his black valet next to him. Gericault also, even in this surge of hope that these figures will be spotted and rescued, calls that into question. In the original sketches for this painting, the boat on the horizon is much larger. There is a boat in this picture. It's just right here at the tip of my pointer, but it's extremely tiny. So we see these figures exerting supreme effort, but that hope of rescue seems to be dim at best. So again, we have this kind of roller coaster of emotions that we might associate with Romanticism. If we look over on the left-hand side of the painting, we see one figure, who's often referred to as the father, who's not hoping for rescue. And there's a couple of explanations that are provided by art historians about why this figure turns away from any hope of rescue. One is explained by the figure who's clutched in his lap. That figure is often called the son. So some art historians explain his reluctance to return through a very traditional Western narrative, that his father has lost his son, his family line will not continue, and he simply cannot face going back to civilization without his progeny. Other art historians, though, point to the idea of cannibalism. And many of the survivors say cannibalism absolutely happened, that this was one of the ways they survived with their extremely limited food and water. But the French government officially denied that any cannibalism happened. Courier and Savigny fold this idea of cannibalism into their abolitionist narrative. One of the justifications for slavery at this time was that black people were somehow inherently different than white people. And they say if white people in this desperate situation in only a week can turn to extremes like cannibalism, then maybe our quote-unquote civilization isn't as defining or differentiating as we think it would be. So some art historians point to the fact that this figure next to him seems to be a kind of partial figure or an incomplete figure, and they suspect that Gericault is hinting at cannibalism here. We do know that Gericault was quite interested in death and dead bodies. He was fascinated by them, and this was a time period when the medical treatment for many things was still amputation. And doctors and hospitals sold body parts out the back door to medical students and others who wanted to study anatomy, including artists. And we know that Gericault brought home many body parts and not only studied them, but studied how they decayed as part of this painting. The face-down figure here on the other side of the father is a portrait of Gericault's friend, the artist Eugene Delacroix. And Delacroix was really the only person that would visit Gericault in his studio while this painting was being painted, because apparently his studio smelled so badly and so much like decaying flesh that it was repugnant to visitors. So many of these romantic artists not only portray these kinds of extreme emotions in their paintings, but they really embody them and live them in their lives as well.